Hey guys, let's take a minute to talk about Spider-Man. Welcome to this episode of Let's Talk. Thanks for watching Comic Book Nostalgia. I'm CB Nostalgia, and today we're going to dive in a little bit to the current state of the rights of Spider-Man and what it means going forward. So, as we've all been following, the Spider-Man deal between Sony Pictures and Marvel Studios has collapsed. So what happens now with our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man? Well, Marvel sold the rights for Spider-Man back in the 1990s, and as a result, their most marketable hero is technically a Sony property. Now, they don't own the character. What they own is an exclusive license to produce this content, and we'll get into that a little more in a little bit. All this changed back in 2015 when Sony and Marvel reached a deal that allows Spider-Man to be rebooted and be part of the MCU. We've seen this unfold, and it has been a rather profitable deal, but unfortunately, that time is now over. With Disney having different priorities, namely Disney Plus, and recouping a lot of the costs of their recent Fox acquisitions, which did cost them a good bit of money, Marvel Studios wants to focus Kevin Feige on making them as much money as possible. In reality, what they really want him to do is focus on some of those new properties re-obtained from Fox, X-Men, and Fantastic Four. Although I'm sure Feige could have found a way, focusing his time on properties that they actually own a stake in and can be more profitable for the corporation is literally the definition of fiduciary responsibility. As for Sony, they think they've learned everything they need to learn from Marvel and are now on the path to try to reintegrate Spider-Man into the developing Venomverse. This is going to be a mess, and there's all kinds of legal rights and entanglement that maybe we should take a couple minutes to talk about. Fortunately for us, the fans, it's really possible to deduce a lot of what's going on behind the scenes with Sony, Marvel, and Disney. If you remember, Sony was hacked way back in 2014 and all kinds of really interesting documents were distributed online. Some of these documents actually included copies of the contracts of Spider-Man with Marvel, including the last version before the Spider-Man deal to bring him into the MCU. It's pretty reasonable to assume that at this point, once this deal is broken down, the rights revert back to something very similar to that 2014 contract. Let's take a couple minutes to talk about what each studio can do. So what can Marvel do with Spider-Man? Well, the end of this whole deal is kind of a disaster for the MCU. Marvel can no longer even mention Spider-Man at all, or Peter Parker, or any character primarily associated with the web-slinger. In fact, they're pretty much restricted from using many characters who were simply introduced in Spider-Man comics, with the exception of some superheroes that have become rather famous in their own right. If you remember, both the Punisher and Cloak and Dagger actually started in Spider-Man and have had their own series recently under Marvel. One of the major downsides of this whole thing is one of the reoccurring rumors before this happened was that Marvel was interested in developing Norman Osborn as the next big major villain in the MCU. Without some sort of renegotiations, this is highly unlikely. That's sort of sad. I think many of us were thinking about a Dark Avengers movie. Now, what Marvel can do is use storylines that Spider-Man appeared in that he just can't be part of the story. That means they're free to adapt some stories, like from the New Avengers, that he was part of, but just can't be included. Apparently, the contract makes no stipulations about whether or not Marvel can adapt a plot pulled right from the comics. This would be kind of like Marvel taking a story that Spider-Man was involved in and then substituting another hero like Iron Fist in the story. More than likely, this will require some additional discussion between Marvel and Sony. One other caveat is the characters that are shared between the studios. Under the old contract, both studios had the right to use Wilson Fisk the Kingpin, and considering he was the villain in the recent Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse movie, this is probably still the case. Another weird character is Jessica Drew. Apparently, Marvel can use her as a private investigator or a spy, as long as they don't give her the Spider-Woman codename. And on the flip side, Sony can actually call her Spider-Woman and use her however they wish. So what can Sony do with Spider-Man? Well, as we said, Sony has an exclusive license to the cinematic rights to Spider-Man. They don't own the character, but they can use him in any way they see fit, and under the contract, no one else is allowed to use that character. They can use Peter Parker, and they have the rights to all existing and future versions of the Wallcrawler. This means Spider-Man 29, Spider-Girl, Cosmic Spider-Man, or even the Scarlet Spider, or any other character you can think of. Additionally, Sony has exclusive rights to all of Spider-Man's supporting characters, and even to many heroes and villains who have been introduced in books starring Spider-Man. These are characters like Silver Sable, Black Cat, and Morbius. If you read the contract, it does go into some specific locations and organizations that are exclusively Sony's also. The Daily Bugle, the Feast Homeless Center, even the Daily Globe are all considered Sony-only properties. Sony does have certain limitations. They can never explicitly reference any MCU character that Spider-Man has ever run into. They can make an allusion to them, but they can never be too explicit about referencing them and certainly cannot call them by name. This means no mention of Thanos, the Decimation, S.H.I.E.L.D., Nick Fury, Tony Stark, or Happy Hogan. To me personally, I see this as a huge narrative problem for Sony. It's going to require some creative writing to overcome it. Sony probably still has a license to use Edith, because it's an artificial intelligence created for a Sony film and has no history in the comics, but that's unclear to me. Interestingly, it is possible for them to use flashbacks from the previous films. Both Spider-Man Homecoming and Spider-Man Far From Home were technically produced by Marvel Studios on Sony's behalf, and thus count as Sony's movies. This does mean Sony could use flashbacks of Iron Man flying alongside Spider-Man, and simply never name the character. Most people really would never notice this, and Iron Man doesn't need to be named, he's that famous. But this is likely something lawyers would have to work out. One of the other interesting things is after looking at the contracts, Sony clearly has the rights to produce Spider-Man content across a range of mediums. As well as movies, they have both live action and animated Spider-Man TV shows in the works. This corresponds with some of the information in the old contract. There are certain caveats that need to be made as we talked about this. The contract is an old one, which means details could have changed at this time. When Marvel and Sony came to a deal, lots of things could be said, and even though Tom Holland's Spider-Man has returned to Sony, whatever deals and arrangements that were put in ink at that point in time could still hold. None of this we've had the opportunity to review or see. It also should be noted that the studios could still come to some sort of agreement, even at a lower level. A deal between Fox and Marvel allowed Deadpool to switch up Negasonic Teenage Warhead's powers, and for that Marvel got to use Ego the Living Planet in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. It's pretty unclear how sour the relationship between Marvel and Sony is right now, but micro-agreements might be a great way to get things back on track. As it stands right now, we have to wait and see what's next for Spider-Man, the Spider-Verse, and the MCU. Personally, I hope they're still able to work all the details out. I suspect fan ire is going to hurt Sony, and although maybe the initial outing of Tom Holland's Spider-Man might be profitable, the return on investment will dip quickly. People seem to forget that Amazing Spider-Man 2 really didn't do so great in the theater, and Sony really didn't make any money, and at that point they were circling the drain and it almost drove him into bankruptcy. So what do you guys think? Hopefully, in the future, we'll find a way to see Spider-Man return with his other Marvel heroes, and everybody will be happy. Till then, we'll have to live with what we have. Sound off in the comments below. If you like this video, make sure you press like below, click subscribe, and if you don't ring that bell, you won't get any updates. Peace.